My name is William, and I'm 63 years old. I've spent nearly 4 decades married to Sarah. Together, we built a comfortable life, a home, a business, and a family. Our 2 children are grown and successful, and I've always taken pride in the stability and structure I've provided. I believed we were a team. But teams don't operate in secrets. Over the past few months, Sarah had started acting differently. I noticed the little things first. The late nights at the gym she never cared about before, the new perfume, and the expensive clothes she suddenly began wearing. It wasn't about looking good for me, that much was clear. Then came the guarded phone. Sarah had always been an open book, but now her phone was either in her hand or face down on the table. Texts would come in, and instead of ignoring them like she used to, she'd pick up the phone and leave the room. I didn't say anything at first, I observed. The reality of relationships is simple, a respect comes from leadership. When a man isn't in control, things fall apart. I should have spoken sooner, but I wasn't going to ignore the signs any longer. One evening, after another girls' night turned into her arriving home past midnight, I confronted her. "Who is it, Sarah?" I asked directly. She froze, then laughed nervously. "What are you talking about?" "You lying," I said plainly. "Your gym, your new habits, the phone, you think I don't notice?" Her denial came too quickly, too rehearsed. "You being paranoid." "I'm just trying to improve myself." No apologies, no accountability. I said nothing more that night, but my decision was made. If she thought I would accept being played for a fool, she was sorely mistaken. The next morning, I called a private investigator. If there was one thing I knew, it was that trust isn't given blindly, it's earned. And Sarah had spent months betraying mine. Hiring a private investigator wasn't a knee-jerk reaction, it was a calculated move. Trust, once broken, isn't something you patch up with words. You need proof, and proof requires action. By the time I made the call, I was done second-guessing. The investigator, James, was professional and discreet. "Give me a week," he said, after I explained the situation. "If there's anything to find, I'll find it." I gave him Sarah's routine, at the gym sessions, the suspicious late nights, and the girls' nights that left her glowing when she returned home. James didn't ask unnecessary questions. He didn't need to, her patterns told their own story. While he worked, I focused on keeping my demeanor steady. If Sarah noticed anything, it could tip her off, and I wanted her comfortable enough to slip further. She was already making mistakes, she just didn't realize I was paying attention. A few days later, James called. His voice carried the weight of a man who'd seen it all. "We need to meet. I've got something you'll want to see." We arranged to meet at a quiet cafe on the edge of town. I arrived early, ordered coffee, and waited. James entered, his presence understated but commanding, and took a seat across from me. He handed over a folder, thick with evidence, photographs, receipts, even a detailed timeline. "She's been meeting someone," he said plainly. "His name's Eric. Personal trainer, mid-30s, single. They meet after her workouts at the gym and sometimes for dinner. There's no doubt about the nature of their relationship." I opened the folder, and there it was, Sarah, laughing too easily, touching his arm in ways I hadn't seen her do with me in years. There were dinner receipts for 2 at upscale restaurants, gym session payments, and even a jewelry store receipt for a watch I knew she hadn't given me. "She's funding him," James added. "The gifts, the meals, it's all coming from your joint account." The anger that had simmered inside me now boiled over into something sharper. This wasn't just about betrayal, it was exploitation. Sarah wasn't just cheating, she was bankrolling her lover with our hard-earned money. James must have noticed the change in my expression because he leaned in. "What do you want to do?" I didn't answer immediately. This wasn't a time for rushed decisions. I thanked him for his work and left with the folder tucked under my arm. Driving home, my thoughts churned. This wasn't just about what Sarah had done. It was about how to make her and Eric understand that their actions had consequences. That night, Sarah came home late again. She walked in with that same air of casual disregard, the faint smell of perfume I didn't recognize lingering in the room. She smiled, the kind of smile meant to disarm. "Late meeting?" I asked, keeping my tone even. "Yeah," she replied without hesitation, dropping her bag on the counter. "You know how it is, these projects always run over." I nodded, pretending to be satisfied with her answer. But inside, I was already planning my next move. Over the next week, I began securing my position. I contacted my lawyer, Mark, a man I trusted implicitly. We discussed everything, protecting my business, freezing our joint accounts, and ensuring that Sarah couldn't take advantage of me any further. Mark was blunt. "You need to act fast. If she's already spending money on this guy, there's no telling what she'll try once she realizes you're onto her." I didn't need convincing. The next day, I moved the majority of our funds into a separate account under my name. I left just enough in the joint account to keep things looking normal for now. I also started gathering my own evidence. Every time Sarah came home late, I made a note of the time. I backed up phone bills and bank statements, ensuring I had copies of everything. I even installed a discreet security camera in the house, not to catch her, but to document her behavior. The breaking point came a week later. Sarah had planned another girls' night, but James had already tipped me off. She wasn't meeting friends, she was meeting Eric at a trendy rooftop bar downtown. This time, I wasn't content to sit back and wait for the evidence to come to me. I drove to the bar, parked across the street, and watched as they arrived together. She looked radiant, laughing as she clung to his arm. He looked smug, the kind of man who thought he was untouchable. I took pictures, my hands steady as I captured every angle. This wasn't about confronting them yet, it was about building an airtight case. When I returned home that night, Sarah was already in bed, her back turned to me. The sight filled me with a cold resolve. The next morning, I finalized my plans. I'd given Sarah the benefit of the doubt for far too long. Now, it was time for consequences. Betrayal is not something I ever thought I would face. When you've been married for nearly 4 decades, you believe that loyalty is a given. But there I was, staring across the kitchen counter at Sarah, knowing everything I once trusted had been systematically dismantled by her choices. She came home late again, carrying that same air of indifference. She walked in with a polished smile that now seemed more like a mask. "Work ran late," she said, tossing her bag onto the counter. "You know how these things go." I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I watched her carefully, letting the silence fill the room. When I finally spoke, my tone was calm but firm. "We need to talk, Sarah." She froze for a moment before brushing off the concern in my voice. "Can it wait?" "I've had a long day." "No, it can't wait," I said, not letting her escape this conversation. There was a pause before she sat down across from me at the kitchen island, her expression guarded. "What is this about?" I slid the folder I had prepared across the counter toward her. "Open it." She hesitated, her hand hovering over the folder as if touching it would confirm her worst fears. Slowly, she opened it, flipping through the pages. Photographs of her and Eric at the gym, receipts from expensive restaurants, and evidence of gifts she had purchased were all meticulously documented. Her face drained of color as she absorbed the contents. When she finally looked up, her voice wavered. "William, this isn't what it looks like." "Then tell me what it is," I said, leaning forward. "Explain the dinners, the jewelry, the late nights you've spent with him instead of working." She stammered, grasping at excuses. "It was nothing serious. I was lonely. You've been so focused on work, and I didn't mean for this to happen." "Lonely?" I said sharply, cutting her off. Do you think I wasn't lonely, Sarah? Do you think I don't feel the weight of everything I do for this family? But I didn't go behind your back. I didn't betray your trust. Her tears began to fall, but I didn't feel pity. It was a mistake, she said, her voice breaking. I didn't know how to tell you. I'm sorry. A mistake is one bad decision, I replied coldly. This was months of lies and deceit. Don't insult me by pretending it was anything else. The room fell silent, the weight of the truth hanging between us. She sat there, defeated, as if realizing that no apology could undo the damage. I've already spoken to a lawyer, I said, breaking the silence. The divorce papers will be ready by the end of the week. You'll be served soon. Her eyes widened, and she reached for my hand. William, wait. We can fix this. I made a mistake, but we can work through it. I pulled my hand away. No, Sarah. You broke this, and I'm not the one who's going to fix it. You made your choice. Now you'll live with the consequences. The following days were filled with action. I wasn't interested in wallowing in sadness or letting her manipulate me further. Instead, I moved decisively. The first step was financial. I transferred the majority of our joint savings into a separate account under my name. I left enough in the joint account to cover basic bills, but not a cent more. I also froze our shared credit cards, ensuring that Sarah couldn't use them to fund any more of Eric's whims. Next, I reached out to my lawyer, Mark, who had already started preparing the divorce paperwork. He assured me that my assets and business were protected, and we discussed how to proceed with dividing the rest of our property. Meanwhile, I began gathering more evidence. Every phone bill, every bank statement, every receipt from the last 6 months was meticulously documented. I wanted an airtight case, not just for the divorce, but to ensure that Sarah couldn't spin this situation in her favor. One evening, as Sarah sat quietly on the couch, I made my next move. By the way, I said casually, you might want to warn Eric. His employer is about to receive some very interesting information about his extracurricular activities. Her head snapped up, her expression a mix of shock and fear. What are you talking about? I sent your boyfriend's boss an email, I said matter-of-factly. It includes photos of the two of you together, receipts for the dinners you shared, and a detailed timeline of your relationship. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She knew I wasn't bluffing. You didn't, she finally managed to say. Oh, I did, I replied. Eric wants to play this game? Let's see how well he does without a job or the reputation he's been using to charm women like you. She started to cry again, but I wasn't interested in her tears. Save your breath, Sarah. You're going to need it to explain yourself to everyone you've lied to. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. The confrontation was just the beginning, and I wasn't done yet. Betrayal never happens in isolation. It's a chain reaction, unraveling everything it touches. Sarah's infidelity wasn't just a betrayal of our marriage, it was a series of calculated choices that implicated others, whether they were aware of it or not. My mission wasn't just to confront her, I intended to dismantle every lie, every illusion she had built. The day after our confrontation, I turned my attention to her closest friends. These were the women she had named as companions during her girls' nights. Whether they were complicit or simply convenient excuses, I was going to find out. I picked up the phone and began making calls. My tone was calm and measured, but there was no mistaking my intent. I wanted to reach out, I began during each conversation, because I've uncovered undeniable proof of Sarah's infidelity. If you had any involvement in covering for her, I suggest you be honest with me now. If you didn't know, you may want to reevaluate your friendship with her. The responses varied. One friend denied everything outright, her voice a little too quick, too cheerful. Another stumbled through her words, unable to explain the specifics of certain evenings. One woman, clearly defensive, accused me of overreacting, as though exposing lies and deceit was somehow a flaw. I didn't need confessions. My goal was to plant seeds of doubt, to destabilize the foundation of Sarah's support system. Doubt, once it takes root, spreads rapidly. By the time I ended the last call, I knew her social circle was beginning to fracture. Eric, too, was starting to face the consequences of his actions. The email I sent to his employer, a detailed account of his affair with Sarah, complete with photos and receipts, had landed exactly where it needed to. Eric worked as a personal trainer at a high-end fitness center, a place where reputation was everything. His behavior wasn't just unethical, it violated company policy. Within days, Eric was fired. James, the private investigator, called me with an update. He's not just out of a job, James reported. His name is circulating. Other gyms are steering clear of him. He's going to find it tough to get work in this field again. The news brought me a grim satisfaction. Eric had walked into my life, thinking he could use Sarah as a ticket to an easy lifestyle. Now, he was learning just how costly his actions would be. At home, Sarah's behavior had shifted. The arrogance, the excuses, the bold denials, they were all gone. She was quieter now, withdrawn. But I could see her calculating, trying to figure out her next move. One evening, as I walked past the study, I overheard her on the phone. "I don't know what to do," she said, her voice strained. "He's cut me off from everything. I feel like I'm drowning." When she saw me standing in the doorway, her face turned pale. She ended the call abruptly, setting her phone down with trembling hands. "What's your plan now, Sarah?" I asked, my voice calm but firm. She didn't answer. Instead, she walked past me, her shoulders slumped, and retreated to the kitchen. The perfect opportunity for my next move came a week later. Sarah had spent months planning a charity dinner, an event meant to showcase her involvement in the community and elevate her reputation. It was exactly the stage I needed to expose her lies. On the day of the event, I prepared a stack of envelopes. Inside each one, I placed a collection of evidence, photographs of Sarah and Eric, bank statements detailing her spending, and a concise summary of her betrayal. A trusted acquaintance who was attending the event agreed to help distribute the envelopes discreetly. That evening, Sarah was radiant. She greeted guests with a polished smile, her confidence seemingly restored. She took the stage to deliver her opening remarks, her voice steady and self-assured. But as she spoke, the atmosphere in the room began to shift. Guests were opening the envelopes, their expressions changing from curiosity to shock. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, growing louder with each passing moment. At first, Sarah didn't notice. She was too focused on her speech. But as the murmurs turned to gasps, her voice faltered. She looked around, confusion and panic flickering across her face. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice wavering. One guest stood up, holding a photograph high for everyone to see. "Sarah," he said, his voice cutting through the room, "do you care to explain this?" The room fell silent. All eyes were on her. For a moment, she stood frozen, her polished exterior crumbling in real time. This is a misunderstanding," she stammered, but the evidence spoke for itself. The whispers turned into outright condemnation. Sarah fled the stage, her face pale and her confidence shattered. When she came home that night, she was furious. "How could you do this to me?" she yelled, slamming the door behind her. "I didn't do this to you," I replied coldly. "You did this to yourself. I just made sure everyone else saw the truth." "This isn't fair," she shouted, her voice breaking with frustration. "You're punishing me for one mistake." "Stop calling it a mistake," I said sharply. "You made deliberate choices, Sarah. Now you're dealing with the consequences." She stormed upstairs, slamming the door to our bedroom. I didn't follow her. There was nothing left to say. By the end of the week, Sarah's world had collapsed completely. Her friends had abandoned her, her reputation was in ruins, and the charity dinner she had spent so much time planning had become a source of humiliation. Eric, too, was suffering. Without a job, his flashy lifestyle was unsustainable. Rumors circulated that he had tried to lean on Sarah for support, but she had refused, unwilling to risk further damage to her already shattered image. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of closure. Sarah and Eric had underestimated me, believing they could manipulate and deceive me without consequences. Now they were facing the fallout of their actions, and I was free to rebuild my life on my own terms. Betrayal doesn't end with exposure. That's just the beginning. Once the lies have been brought to light, there's the aftermath, tying off the loose ends, dismantling the remains of what was, and ensuring that the people who caused the pain can no longer wield any control over your life. Sarah and Eric had underestimated me from the start, assuming I would either remain oblivious or be too passive to act decisively. Now, with her reputation in ruins and his career in shambles, it was time to sever any remaining ties. The morning after the charity dinner, Sarah emerged from the bedroom looking like she hadn't slept. Her usually polished appearance was disheveled, her eyes red from crying. She tried to avoid me, moving silently through the house as though her presence wouldn't be noticed. I wasn't going to let her play the victim. "Sarah," I called, my voice steady but firm. She froze, one hand clutching the kitchen counter. "What?" she asked without turning around. "We need to finalize this," I said. "No more stalling, no more excuses. You moving out." She spun around, her face a mixture of desperation and anger. "Move out? Where am I supposed to go, William? I don't have anywhere." "That's not my problem," I replied bluntly. "You made choices, Sarah. You decided to prioritize your affair over this marriage. Now you'll face the consequences of those choices." Her anger flared. "You being cruel. After everything we've been through, after everything I've done for this family, you throwing me out?" I didn't flinch. "Everything you've done for this family?" I echoed. "Don't pretend this was about the family. You spent months lying, spending our money on him, humiliating me. Whatever sympathy you're looking for, it's not here." Her shoulders slumped as the weight of her situation began to sink in. "I'll give you 2 weeks to find a place," I continued. "After that, I want you gone. I've already spoken to my lawyer. The divorce papers will be ready by the end of the week." After Sarah stormed out of the house, I called my lawyer to confirm the next steps. The financial side of things was already in motion. I had moved the bulk of our joint savings into a separate account in my name, leaving only a minimal amount to cover shared expenses for the next few weeks. Mark, my lawyer, had also advised me on protecting my business. "We'll ensure that her claims to your company are minimized," he said. "Given the circumstances, we have a strong case to keep most of your assets intact." I wasn't about to let Sarah take what I had built, especially not after she'd spent months funneling money into her affair. Meanwhile, Eric's situation continued to worsen. James, the private investigator, kept me updated. "He's been trying to contact Sarah," James reported during one of our calls. "Seems like he's looking for a lifeline. He's broke, jobless, and getting desperate." That didn't surprise me. Men like Eric, opportunists who prey on the weaknesses of others, are only loyal as long as it serves them. Now that his comfortable setup was gone, he was scrambling. I made it clear to James that I didn't want Sarah using what was left of our resources to bail Eric out. "Monitor their communication," I instructed. "If she tries to siphon money to him, let me know immediately." James was thorough. Within days, he'd intercepted a message from Sarah to Eric, offering to help him get back on his feet. She hadn't made any transfers yet, but it was clear she intended to. I forwarded the message to Mark. "This will be useful," he said. We can use it to reinforce the case against her. 2 days later, I called Sarah into the living room. She looked wary, as though she knew what was coming. "I know you've been in contact with Eric," I began, holding up a printout of the intercepted message. Her eyes widened. "You spying on me now?" "Don't play the victim," I snapped. "You've already done enough damage, and you don't get to use my money to fund his life." "I wasn't going to actually send him anything," she protested. "Doesn't matter," I said coldly. "The fact that you even thought about it shows where your priorities still lie. This ends now, Sarah. I've frozen the remaining joint funds. You'll get what the court decides you're entitled to, and nothing more." Her face crumpled, but I didn't feel a shred of pity. She had made her choices. That evening, I sent a formal letter to Eric, warning him to cease all contact with Sarah and myself. I didn't mince words. If he attempted to interfere in any way, I would pursue legal action against him. James confirmed that the letter was delivered, and Eric hadn't responded. Perhaps he finally understood that his time leeching off of Sarah, and by extension, me, was over. The following week, I met with Mark to finalize the divorce proceedings. "You've done well to stay ahead of this," he said as we reviewed the paperwork. "Sarah won't have much room to maneuver." "That's the point," I replied. Once the papers were served, Sarah's reaction was predictable. She alternated between pleading for forgiveness and lashing out in anger, accusing me of being heartless. But her words had no effect. I had made my decision, and there was no going back. By the end of the second week, Sarah had packed her belongings and moved out of the house. Watching her leave didn't bring me joy, but it brought closure. As Sarah moved out of the house, I felt the weight of months of deceit finally begin to lift. It wasn't joy I felt, it was closure. For decades, I had built my life around her, believing in the strength of our partnership. Now, I was left with a mess to clean up and a future to rebuild, but at least it was mine to control. Her departure wasn't a clean break, though. The remnants of her choices lingered, and I wasn't naive enough to think there wouldn't be fallout from everything I'd exposed. A few days after Sarah left, I received a phone call from Mark, my lawyer. "We've received a response from her attorney," he said, his tone professional but firm. "It's clear they're going to push for a larger settlement." I sighed. "What's their argument?" "They're claiming she contributed significantly to the success of your business over the years," Mark explained. "They're also trying to frame this as a reaction to neglect, claiming you worked too much and didn't prioritize the marriage." I scoffed at the absurdity. Contributed significantly? She never even glanced at a balance sheet. And blaming me for working hard? That's rich, considering she used that time to sneak around with Eric. Mark chuckled softly. "Don't worry. We've anticipated this. I've compiled enough documentation to refute those claims. Between the financial evidence and the timeline of her affair, her case is weak. This is a standard tactic to push for more than she deserves." I trusted Mark to handle the legal side, but that conversation lit a fire in me. Sarah's audacity to paint herself as a victim was infuriating, and I wasn't about to let her rewrite history. Meanwhile, James continued to keep tabs on Eric. His updates painted a grim picture. Without a job and with no connections left in the fitness industry, Eric had been forced to move out of his upscale apartment. "He's staying with a friend now," James reported. "Barely scraping by. He hasn't made any attempts to contact Sarah again, at least not that I've seen." That was good news. I wanted Eric completely out of the picture, not just for my sake but to ensure he couldn't manipulate Sarah into further complicating the situation. The fallout extended beyond Sarah and Eric, though. In the weeks following the charity dinner, whispers about the scandal spread through our community. People who had once praised Sarah for her poise and leadership were now openly criticizing her. At the grocery store, I overheard two women talking near the produce aisle. "Did you hear what happened at the dinner?" one of them whispered. Of course, the other replied. I can't believe she thought she could get away with it. And that trainer of hers? What a mess. They didn't notice me standing nearby, but I felt no need to announce myself. Their words were a reminder of how far Sarah had fallen in the eyes of the people she once sought to impress. Despite the turmoil, I began to find small moments of clarity. My days, once dominated by tension and suspicion, felt lighter. I threw myself into my work, focusing on projects I'd put on hold while dealing with the fallout of Sarah's betrayal. One afternoon, as I sorted through old files in my home office, I stumbled across a folder filled with photos from earlier in our marriage. There we were, smiling at family barbecues, celebrating holidays, and even standing proudly in front of the first home we'd purchased together. For a moment, I let myself feel the sadness. There had been good times, moments when I believed we were unshakable. But those moments were now overshadowed by what she'd done. I couldn't live in the past anymore. I took the folder and placed it in a box marked storage. Those memories weren't gone, but they no longer defined my future. One evening, I received an unexpected call from my son, Jason. "Dad, how are you holding up?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. "I'm doing all right," I said honestly. "It's been a lot to process, but I'm getting through it." Jason hesitated before speaking again. "I wanted to tell you something. I talked to Mom yesterday. She's a mess, Dad. She kept saying how sorry she is and how much she regrets what happened." I stayed silent, letting his words settle. "I'm not saying you should forgive her," Jason continued. "But I think she's starting to realize just how much she's lost." "Jason," I said, my voice firm, "forgiveness isn't on the table. What she did wasn't a mistake, it was a series of choices that destroyed everything we built. Regret doesn't erase that." He sighed. "I get it. I just thought you should know." "Thanks for telling me," I replied. "But I've made my decision. I'm moving forward, and she's no longer part of that." By the time Sarah's attorney reached out with a revised settlement offer, Mark and I were prepared. The offer was far less aggressive than their initial demands, a sign that they knew her position was weak. "We'll counter with this," Mark said, sliding a document across his desk during our meeting. "It's fair and ensures she gets only what she's entitled to, nothing more." I signed without hesitation. This was the final step in cutting the strings that had bound me to her. The divorce was finalized a month later. I watched Sarah sign the papers with a detached calm, knowing this chapter of my life was officially over. As she left the lawyer's office, she turned to me one last time. "Goodbye, William," she said softly, her voice heavy with regret. I nodded. "Goodbye, Sarah." Her departure wasn't the dramatic end I once envisioned, but it didn't need to be. The real victory was in reclaiming my life, free from her lies and manipulation. The divorce was final. Sarah was gone. What remained was a life in need of repair, a house filled with ghosts of what used to be, a social circle that had been neglected, and a future waiting to be reclaimed. I didn't feel triumphant or bitter as she walked out of the lawyer's office for the last time. What I felt was relief, and maybe even a little hope. It was time to rebuild, piece by piece, until my life was wholly mine again. The first step was the house. For years, it had been a reflection of Sarah's tastes. The pale walls, the floral curtains, the furniture she'd picked, all of it felt foreign now, like relics of someone else's life. I started with the bedroom. The bed was replaced with something new, chosen by me this time. I painted the walls a deep grey blue, a color that felt calm and strong, unlike the soft pastels Sarah had preferred. I threw out the decorative pillows she loved but I always found pointless, replacing them with simple, comfortable bedding. Her framed photos and knickknacks were packed into boxes. I didn't throw them away, there was no need for theatrics. But they no longer belonged in my space. The kitchen was next. I donated the china set Sarah had insisted on buying, the one we rarely used but always displayed. I bought sturdy plates and mugs that felt practical and solid, a reflection of the life I wanted to build. Cooking became a small ritual of reclamation. The act of preparing meals in a space that now felt like mine was unexpectedly satisfying. Next, I turned my attention outward. Over the months of suspicion, investigation, and confrontation, I had unintentionally pushed away many of the people who mattered. Friends I'd known for years had reached out, offering support, but I had kept them at a distance, too caught up in the chaos of my unraveling marriage. One of the first calls I made was to Tom, a friend I'd known since college. We hadn't spoken in months. "William." Tom's booming voice came through the line. "I was starting to think you'd fallen off the face of the earth." "Not quite," I replied, a small smile tugging at my lips. "It's been a lot. But I'm finally coming out the other side." "Well, it's about time," he said warmly. "Come over this weekend. I'm having a few people over for a barbecue. Nothing fancy, just good food and better company." The thought of being around people again felt strange, but I knew I needed to start somewhere. The barbecue was exactly what I needed. It wasn't a large gathering, just a handful of close friends and their families. The smell of grilled burgers and the sound of laughter filled the air, and for the first time in months, I felt like myself again. Tom handed me a beer and pulled me aside. "You look better," he said, his tone serious but kind. "Like a weight's been lifted." "It has," I admitted. I didn't realize how heavy it was until it was gone. "Well, whatever it was, I'm glad to see you coming out on the other side," Tom said. "You've got a lot of life ahead of you, William. Don't forget that." Work also became an anchor. My construction business, which I had built from the ground up, had taken a backseat during the chaos of the divorce. Now, I threw myself into it with renewed focus. One afternoon, during a visit to a job site, Mike, my foreman, approached me with a grin. "Good to have you back on site, boss," he said. "The guys missed seeing you around." "Thanks, Mike," I replied. "It's good to be back." There was something grounding about being on site, watching a project come together from the foundation up. It was a reminder that even when things fall apart, they can be rebuilt, stronger, better, and more resilient than before. Of course, not every moment was easy. There were times, especially on quiet evenings, when the memories would creep in. I'd remember the early days of my marriage to Sarah, the moments when we laughed together, made plans, and dreamed of a shared future. But I had learned not to dwell. The past, while it shaped me, didn't define where I was going. I let the memories come, acknowledged them, and then moved on. One of the most unexpected moments of clarity came from my son, Jason. He visited one afternoon with his wife and their 2 kids, bringing life and energy to the house. As I watched my grandchildren play in the backyard, their laughter echoing through the air, Jason sat beside me on the porch. "Dad, you're doing great," he said. "I know this hasn't been easy, but you've handled it better than anyone could expect." "Thanks, Jason," I said, my voice steady. "It hasn't been easy, but I've learned that sometimes you have to let go of what's weighing you down to move forward." Jason nodded. "Mom's struggling," he said cautiously. "She's been reaching out, trying to figure out what's next for her." "That's her journey to figure out," I replied. "I've made my decision. My future doesn't include her." Jason didn't press the issue, and I was grateful for that. Rebuilding my life wasn't about replacing what was lost. It was about rediscovering who I was and what I wanted. Every step forward, no matter how small, was a reminder that I was capable of creating something new, something better. As I rebuilt my life, piece by piece, I began to realize something, and while I had done well in removing Sarah's influence from my surroundings, I had yet to confront the emotional weight of everything that had happened. It's easy to focus on actions, redecorating, working, reconnecting with friends, but the mind doesn't always move on as quickly as the body does. there were nights when I couldn't escape the lingering shadows of betrayal. The memories would replay in my mind, the whispered phone calls, the forged excuses, the lies that she had told with such confidence. I had been so caught up in uncovering the truth and seeking justice that I hadn't fully processed what her actions had done to me. It was time to face those shadows head-on. One Saturday morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. I decided to drive out to a quiet spot by the lake, a place I used to visit before life got too busy. The drive itself was therapeutic, windows down, the crisp air filling the car as I followed the winding roads through familiar countryside. When I arrived, the lake was just as I remembered it, still, serene, and surrounded by towering trees that seemed to stand as silent witnesses to the passage of time. I found a bench overlooking the water and sat down, letting the calmness of the place settle over me. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to feel everything. The anger was still there, burning quietly in the background. But beneath it was something deeper, a sadness I hadn't fully acknowledged. Sarah's betrayal wasn't just about the affair. It was about the loss of trust, the shattering of something I had once believed to be unbreakable. I sat there for hours, letting the emotions wash over me. It wasn't easy. But by the time I left, I felt lighter, as though acknowledging the pain had loosened its grip on me. That evening, I decided to tackle another lingering reminder of the past, the letters. During the early years of our marriage, Sarah and I had written letters to each other on anniversaries, birthdays, and even random days when we felt like putting our thoughts to paper. I had kept every single one of them in a small wooden box in the back of my closet. I pulled the box out and placed it on the table, staring at it for a long moment before opening the lid. Inside were dozens of envelopes, each marked with dates and small notes in Sarah's handwriting. At first, I hesitated. Did I really want to go through these? Would reading them help me move on, or would it only reopen wounds that were just beginning to heal? Eventually, I decided that avoiding them wouldn't solve anything. I picked up the first letter and began to read. Her words were a time capsule, capturing moments of joy, love, and hope. There were letters from the year we bought our first house, letters written during vacations, and even one from the night before Jason was born. For a while, I let myself remember those times, the good moments that had once defined our marriage. But as I read, I also saw the shift. Her words became less frequent, less heartfelt. The promises of love and partnership gave way to notes of obligation, devoid of the warmth they once carried. I reached the last letter in the box, one from our 30th wedding anniversary. It was short, generic, and entirely impersonal. It was clear that by then, whatever connection we had shared was already fading. I placed the letters back in the box, closed the lid, and carried it out to the garage. I didn't throw it away. Not yet. But I also knew that it no longer had a place in my home. The next morning, Jason called me. "Hey, Dad," he said, his tone casual. "What are you up to?" "Just taking it easy," I replied. "Good. You need that. Listen, I was thinking, how about we go fishing next weekend? Just the two of us, like we used to." I smiled. "I'd like that. It's been a while." "Great. I'll bring the gear. You just show up." The fishing trip was exactly what I needed. We spent the day on the water, the rhythmic motion of casting and reeling acting as a kind of meditation. Jason didn't push me to talk about Sarah or the divorce. Instead, we talked about simpler things, his kids, his plans, and my work. At one point, as we sat in comfortable silence, Jason spoke up. "You different now, Dad. Stronger, I think." "Stronger?" I echoed, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah," he said with a nod. "You're not carrying the weight of everything anymore. I can see it." His words stayed with me long after the trip was over. That week, I made another significant decision. I reached out to a counselor. I'd always been the kind of man who prided himself on handling things alone. But I realized that sometimes, strength isn't about doing it all on your own, it's about knowing when to ask for help. The first session was eye-opening. The counselor didn't push me to talk about anything I wasn't ready to, but she asked questions that made me think. "What does moving forward look like to you?" she asked near the end of the session. "Peace," I said after a long pause. "Building something that's mine. Something that no one else can take away." "Then that's where we'll start," she said with a kind smile. The end of my marriage wasn't just about severing ties with Sarah, it was about rediscovering myself. For years, my identity had been intertwined with being her husband, a role I had once cherished but had since outgrown. Now, with that chapter behind me, I had the rare opportunity to define who I wanted to be moving forward. The first step in rebuilding was reconnecting with the things I had lost over time. One of those things was woodworking. When Jason was a baby, I had spent hours in the garage crafting toys, furniture, and even a small rocking chair. Over time, Sarah's preference for store-bought perfection and her complaints about the mess had pushed me away from it. But now, the garage was mine again. I cleared off the old workbench, cleaned the tools, and began working on a simple project, a small table for the living room. At first, my hands were clumsy, as though they'd forgotten the craft. But as I measured, sanded, and pieced the wood together, the rhythm returned. By the time I applied the final coat of varnish, I felt a sense of accomplishment I hadn't experienced in years. The table wasn't flawless, it had uneven edges and a slight wobble, but it was mine, and that was what mattered. Around the same time, Tom reached out. He'd been persistent throughout the chaos of the divorce, but I'd kept him at arm's length. Now, I was ready to re-engage. "William," he said one evening, his voice warm and steady, "you've been stuck in that house too long. Come to trivia night with me. You need to get out." "I don't know, Tom," I replied hesitantly. "You coming," he said firmly. "No excuses. 7 o'clock. I'll save you a seat." The bar was livelier than I expected, filled with the hum of laughter and conversation. Tom had secured a table near the back, and he greeted me with a grin as I walked in. "About time you got here," he said, sliding a drink toward me. "Let's see if you still have that encyclopedic knowledge of useless facts." The questions ranged from history and geography to pop culture, and while I wasn't much help with the latter, I surprised myself by recalling obscure historical events that even Tom didn't know. By the end of the night, I was laughing freely, something I hadn't done in months. "See," Tom said as we left. "You still in there. Don't let life keep you in the shadows." Another unexpected opportunity came in the form of an email from the local community center. They were hosting a seminar series on mentoring for small business owners, and one of the sessions focused on sharing experiences with aspiring entrepreneurs. The idea intrigued me. For decades, I had poured my energy into building a construction business from scratch. I had weathered economic downturns, made my share of mistakes, and learned valuable lessons. Passing on that knowledge felt like a way to create something meaningful from my experiences. The seminar was a small gathering, held in a modest conference room with about a dozen attendees. When it was my turn to speak, I shared my journey, from the challenges of starting with nothing to the satisfaction of watching the business grow. Afterward, a young man approached me. "Hearing your story gave me a lot of hope," he said. "I've been thinking about starting a home renovation business, but I didn't know where to begin. Listening to you made me feel like I can do this." His words stayed with me long after the seminar ended. Knowing that I could inspire someone else reminded me of the value of the life I had built, despite the setbacks. At home, the changes I made were starting to feel permanent. The walls I had repainted, the furniture I'd chosen, the projects I'd completed, all of them reflected who I was becoming. The house, once filled with the weight of Sarah's presence, now felt like a sanctuary. Jason visited more often, sometimes bringing his wife and kids. One weekend, as we repaired a fence in his backyard, he turned to me and said, "You're doing great, Dad. You seem lighter." "Lighter?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. Yeah, he said. Like you've let go of everything that was holding you down. It's good to see. His observation caught me off guard, but he was right. I hadn't realized how much had changed until he pointed it out. One sunny afternoon, I went for a walk in the park near my house. The paths were lined with tall trees, their leaves rustling in the breeze. As I wandered, I came across a small group gathered around a band playing live music. The tunes were lively, the kind that made you want to tap your foot or nod along. I noticed a woman standing near the edge of the crowd. She was about my age, her face kind and open, her smile genuine. She caught me looking and gave a small nod. I hesitated for a moment before nodding back. It was a simple exchange, but it reminded me that the world was still full of possibilities. That evening, as I sat in my living room, I reflected on the changes in my life. The pain and betrayal of the past no longer defined me. Instead, I was beginning to see a future shaped by hope and resilience. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I needed to be. The end of my marriage felt like the end of my world for a long time, but as I pieced my life back together, I saw it differently. It wasn't the end, it was a new beginning, a chance to rebuild with intention and purpose. By the time the year came to an end, I found myself looking forward, not back, ready to embrace the life I was shaping. One of the most transformative steps I took was joining a charity housing build organized by a local nonprofit. Construction had been my career for decades, but this project wasn't about work. It was about contributing to something meaningful and reconnecting with the satisfaction of building something that would last. The morning of the build was crisp, the air filled with the hum of saws and the sharp rhythm of hammers. Volunteers of all ages moved purposefully, assembling scaffolding and hauling materials. William, called Rick, the project leader. I turned to see him approaching with a clipboard. "That's me," I said, shaking his hand. "Glad to have someone with experience," Rick said. "We're framing House 3 today, and we could use a steady hand." In the framing team, I was paired with Ellen, a confident and sharp-witted woman who immediately made an impression. "You look like you've done this before," she said, handing me a level. "I've been in construction for decades," I replied. "Good," she said with a small grin. "Stick with me, we'll make a solid team." As we worked, Ellen and I began talking. She told me about losing her husband years earlier and how she'd slowly rebuilt her life. "Starting over isn't easy," she said, holding a beam steady as I secured it. "But it's worth it when you finally start to see what's possible." Her words stayed with me long after the day ended. Before we left the site, Ellen handed me her number. Over the following weeks, we met for coffee and took long walks in the park. There was no pressure, no rush, just the comfort of talking with someone who understood what it meant to rebuild a life. One evening, as we sat on a bench overlooking the lake, Ellen turned to me and said, "You seem different than when we first met." "Lighter, maybe." "I think I've let go of a lot," I replied. "It wasn't easy, but I finally feel like I'm moving forward." Her smile was warm and understanding. "Good," she said. "You're doing great." While my connection with Ellen grew, so did my involvement with the Community Center's mentoring program. Helping young entrepreneurs navigate the challenges of building a business had become a cornerstone of my routine. One of my mentees, Danielle, had recently launched her renovation company and was struggling with the growing pains of her new venture. "It feels like every time I solve one problem, another 3 pop up," she said during one of our sessions. "That's how it is in the beginning," I told her. "The key is to focus on what you can control and learn from everything else. Setbacks aren't failures, they're just lessons in disguise." Seeing Danielle gain confidence and find her footing reminded me of my own early days. It felt good to know that my experiences could help someone else succeed. Jason remained a steady presence throughout this time. One weekend, as we repaired a section of his backyard fence, he surprised me with an observation. "You seem happier, Dad," he said, handing me a wrench. "Happier?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. Yeah, he said. It's like you've finally let go of whatever was weighing you down. His words stayed with me. Jason had seen me at my lowest, and hearing him recognize how far I'd come felt like validation. New Year's Eve was a quiet but meaningful celebration. I spent the evening at Jason's house, surrounded by family. My grandchildren's laughter filled the room as they played with sparklers in the backyard, their joy infectious. As the clock struck midnight, Jason raised his glass. To new beginnings, he said, his voice steady and full of hope. To new beginnings, I echoed, feeling those words resonate deeply. Driving home that night, I reflected on how much had changed. The pain and betrayal that once consumed me were now just memories, chapters of my life that had taught me lessons but no longer defined me. Ellen's words from the build came back to me, starting over isn't easy, but it's worth it when you finally see what's possible. She was right. For the first time in years, I felt ready to embrace the future, not with fear, but with hope.